Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director at Word on Fire, and joining us this week after a couple weeks off is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, it's wonderful to have you back.
Hey Brandon, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Now we're recording this on the other side of the new year. It's 2017. How was Christmas and New Year's for you?
Good. I had Christmas Eve here in the region. I said Mass at one of our local prisons for young people in Ventura. And then Christmas Eve in the evening, I was at one of our great parishes in Carpinteria. And then I flew home on Christmas Day, and I spent a week in Chicago visiting family and friends and all my Mundelein connections. Then I flew back, and that very next day, I started the retreat with the bishops of the LA province. So mostly the bishops from like Southern California, all gathered at the House of Prayer, which is a great place in LA, not far from the Hollywood sign. It's right near the Griffith Park Observatory, that area, if you know Los Angeles. So we spent a full week there, pretty much in silence. And I just got back from that a couple days ago.
So how does a retreat like that work? Is there a retreat leader or master giving talks, or are you sort of self-directed? How did it work?
The way we do it here, which I like, is the retreat is basically in silence. So we take our meals in silence. We had a couple of nights that we would break that tradition so we could visit with each other at dinner time, but mostly silence. Then each one of us is assigned a spiritual director. So I think there were 5 priests that volunteered to do the spiritual direction. And then each one of us met for about an hour a day with the director. And last year I worked with a Jesuit, and I did the Ignatian exercises. This year it was actually a wonderful priest from my own region, Father Matt Elsoff, who's a Capuchin. So we just did a different approach, a little more Franciscan in style. But I met with him every day. And then usually I'd spend 2 or maybe 3 holy hours a day. I'd spend time with the Blessed Sacrament. I did some spiritual reading during that time, but a lot of silence. I also went for, I think it was 3 or 4 wonderful walks with Bishop Dave O'Connell. He was one of the bishops ordained with me a year and a half ago. Dave's a wonderful guy, and we both like to walk for exercise. So we went up near the Hollywood sign, way up in the hills there, and had a lot of great talks and time together. So that's how we spent the 7 days.
Now, what a wonderful segue into the topic of our show. You used the word silence several times, talking about your silent retreat. And we're going to be talking about that great and intriguing movie called Silence. Now, I want to warn listeners that this episode will probably contain a few spoilers. If you've read the book Silence, you probably should be all right. But if you haven't read the book and you haven't seen the movie, you might want to postpone listening to this until you do. So just a heads up there. So first of all, Bishop, this new movie, which is directed by Martin Scorsese, is based on a book, a classic Catholic novel called Silence. First, tell us what the book's about. Give us a general sense of its main plot.
It's about the 17th century in Japan, which was a time when Christianity was really under assault. So Francis Xavier in the previous century had established Christianity in Japan. And actually, it had done pretty well. It had taken root there. But then for all kinds of reasons, mostly political, powers had shifted in Japan, and now they were fiercely opposed to Christianity, which they probably saw as a kind of European imposition. Anyway, it's a novel set during that time when the church was very much under persecution. It's about 2 young Jesuits who are sent to Japan to investigate this mystery. Namely, that their great hero, a Father Ferreira, who had taught them in the seminary, he was a great Jesuit hero. The rumor was that he had gone over to the other side, that he had abandoned his faith and was now working for the Japanese. And these young missionaries just can't believe it. They feel there's got to be more to the story. So they've been sent to uncover. Well, what happens then, of course, is they get caught up in all the maelstrom of being a Christian in Japan at that time, and the story then unfolds.
Do you remember reading the book for the first time? When was that, and what was your initial reaction?
Well, I think I was in college, maybe. It's a book that was well known to people in my generation. He's often called, I think correctly, the Japanese Graham Greene because he loves that kind of exploring that kind of dilemma. What does a person of faith do during a time of crisis? Think of the whiskey priest in The Power and the Glory. Silence is a bit like that. It's exploring the way novelists like to do all the psychological and spiritual complexity of having the faith under trying circumstances.
So the book begins, as you say, with this revelation that Father Ferreira, who is the great mentor of these young priests, had apparently apostatized. And I remember I first read the book just a few months ago before the movie came out, and I tried to put myself in that position thinking, what if somebody had told me that Bishop Barron had gone off to China and that he had given up the faith? Or I thought from your perspective, if somebody had told you that Cardinal George had given up the faith, right, how would you react? What would you think?
Yeah, with the same kind of horror and disbelief. But and to give the novel its full due, because qua novel, I think it's a very interesting exploration. And it's just that question. So here I am, Bishop Barron, and from your perspective, you couldn't imagine, that I would ever do that. But if I'm really super honest, if I was under torture, if there were so many factors being brought to bear, I mean, would I have the courage to stand up? If I'm being brutally honest, I'd probably say, well, I hope so. I please God I would. But, what would we do under those circumstances? And the novel presses that question.
So as the novel unfolds, these two young priests go on a long mission to find their mentor, and immediately upon landing in Japan, they encounter sort of an underground Christian community. Tell us what that's like.
Well, and just to anticipate a little bit, I think it's in the heart of the novelist, Shusaku Endo. They're the heroes of the story, not the priests. That the heroes of the story are these faithful lay people who, under the most inhospitable conditions imaginable, and without benefit of priests and the sacraments, kept the faith alive in Japan. And these young kids, it's striking in the movie because the two actors chosen for these priests, Andrew Garfield, who played Spider-Man, and then Adam Driver, who played Kylo Ren in their most recent Star Wars movie. They're very young men, and you see these basically kids arriving, and they're met by very venerable older people. And you can just see in their faces who've been through a lot. And they protect them and greet them with tremendous joy. These priests have come. But at the same time, these are great elder figures. You know what I'm saying? They're like presbyteroi. They're elders of the community. And they, in my judgment, are the great heroes of the story.
It seems that with all the characters, the running question throughout the film is, how would you respond when your faith is tested? And we see that with the priests. We see that with the sort of Judas figure named Kichijiro. We see it with the martyrs who do end up dying for the faith. One thing I found interesting and a bit troubling was how there was this comment made about Kichijiro, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, who in essence turns over the two priests. He gives them up to the Japanese authorities, and he sort of appeals to the priest saying, oh, but if I was born in another era when there wasn't this level of persecution, when I could live my faith comfortably, then I wouldn't have betrayed you, and therefore I would have gone to heaven. And so it brings up this interesting question that our circumstances play a large part in whether we're able to survive the faith or not. I think, today I live in 21st century Western, America. And so it's pretty easy for me to stay strong in my faith. But if I lived in the Middle East right now and ISIS were breathing down my neck, how would I respond?
That's the question that the novel raises. And I think it's a darn good question, and it's from a novelist perspective, good. It's a good thing to explore. I think of your great hero and mine, Tolkien, and Gandalf's famous speech, was it to Merry or Pippin, one of the two, about, it's not ours to decide what time that we have, but to do what we must do with the time that we've been given, And that's a speech that comes back to my mind a lot, is this time that we're in, you and I, good and bad, yeah. Can we catch ourselves saying, boy, it would be so much easier to be a Catholic or be a priest, 50 years ago, or, oh, what if I was a priest in the high Middle Ages and I was working with Thomas Aquinas? Wouldn't that be wonderful? Well, yes and no. Every time has its unique quality. And we shouldn't speculate about that so much, but simply, okay, here's a time I've been given. What do I do? Thomas More, one of the great martyrs, the great saints, did all he could to avoid coming to martyrdom. He used his wily lawyer's mind to get around it. And I don't mean that in a cynical way at all, or a dismissive way. This was the challenge of his time, and he did the best he could until he realized, no, I can't compromise any further. I can't compromise on this point, and then he faced his fate. So that's the question, isn't it? Is whatever time you're in, a time of relative ease, a time of great persecution, that's not yours to decide. It's what you do with the time you've been given. That's what everything hinges upon.
I'm glad you mentioned Thomas More, because as I read the book, he was a man who kept coming to mind for me. In the Silence novel, one of the ways that the Japanese authorities were able to stamp out Christianity was by forcing the people to step on this image. They called it the Fumiya, or the Fumi, which was a painting or an image of either Christ or his mother. And so by stepping on it, you were showing that you were not really a follower of Christ. Now, many of the characters sort of go through this conundrum of, well, can I just step on it even if I don't really mean it? And it brought to mind Thomas More. He was encouraged, just sign this thing even if you don't mean it.
But in your heart, think otherwise.
Yeah. So, what do we make of that? I mean, in the pivotal scene, again, this is a spoiler here, in the pivotal scene of the movie and the book, Father Rodriguez decides that he should step on the Fumiya. In fact, he says something like, it's what Christ would have done if he was here himself. He came so that people could step on his face. What do we make of that conclusion?
Yeah, I mean, it's the hinge, it's the pivotal point, as you say, in the whole novel. And in the novel, as well as in the movie, he does hear this voice at that moment. And, they're playing on the idea of silence, that God remains silent during all this. And it appears as though God breaks his silence to say, yes, as you say, I came to be persecuted, so go ahead, do this, and you'll free people from their suffering, etc. But in the novel, certainly, and I frankly don't remember in the movie if it was reproduced, but in the novel, when he steps on the picture, a cock crows. And so it's the biblical image of the betrayal of Peter, So in my mind, there's no question that it was indeed an act of betrayal. And whatever voice that was, I don't know. I don't think it's the voice of Jesus. I think it's the voice of his own imagination, the voice of a darker power maybe. But I think it was clearly an act of betrayal. Now, understandable given the circumstances, sure, we could play with that. But what makes the story, and Endo, of course, intended this, what makes it even more pointed is now for the next several decades, this young man who has renounced his faith continually renounces his faith, year in and year out. And now he becomes a sort of paid lackey of the state and is given all kinds of privileges. And he continues to deny his faith. So we don't get the easy out. You know what I'm saying? The easy out of, under that terrible pressure, wouldn't any of us have given it? Well, maybe, but then it's year in, year out, decade in, decade out, till the end of his life. So that's why Endo and Scorsese in the movie are pressing that question.
Now, you get this as an evangelist. There's always the consequentialist temptation that, we could take this action, which might be imprudent or immoral, but it would lead to this seemingly great benefit. So from the Endo perspective, if I just step on this Fumiya, it could save these people and allow Christianity to flourish, but at what cost? How often are we tempted as evangelists to take the easy way out, even if we think it'll produce remarkable results.
Yeah, and you're right. It's a hinge point in Catholic moral thinking. So let's say you're in that situation where, if you just do this terrible thing, then the suffering of others will be relieved. Well, see, that's not your responsibility. If some wicked person is making innocent people suffer, and they are tying it somehow to your act of renunciation of the faith, you can't take responsibility for what they're doing. And to put it in the pithy formula of the tradition, you can't do evil that good might come of it, right? And so, understandable psychologically, sure, but theologically, no, that's an incoherent move. They have to bear the weight of that great immorality, not you. And you can't be compelled by that to do something which you know in conscience to be intrinsically evil, to use that language.
Now, during this climactic scene, Father Rodriguez does finally meet his mentor, Father Ferreira, the mentor who did, in fact, apostatize. The rumors were true. And Father Ferreira is encouraging Father Rodriguez to follow the same path he did, which is to step on the fumia, to become a lackey of the state, to renounce his faith, etc. And even Father Rodriguez is wondering, well, is he only doing this to justify his own actions, or does he really think this is what I should do? Anyway, the argument that he makes is that Japan is, quote, a swamp where the seed of Christianity can never take root. Do you think that's true? I mean, isn't there something to the fact that of all the countries in the East and all the countries in the world, Japan seems to be this one where Christianity finds great difficulty taking off? Why is that?
Well, yeah, you're raising, of course, a complicated issue. To answer the first question very directly, I'd say no. And my justification is the Lord's own command. Go and pronounce the gospel to all nations. He didn't say pronounce it to most nations or those that are kind of open to it. But, there are going to be a couple that aren't going to be too agreeable. He said, go announce it to all nations. And furthermore, the message of the gospel is one that satisfies the deepest longing of the human heart. It's not tied to a culture. The Catholic Church has taken in a variety of cultures. It begins as a Middle Eastern phenomenon. It begins as a Semitic Jewish phenomenon. Rather quickly assimilates to itself the wisdom of Greece and Rome. And then, look at an often forgotten part of our history. The church went dramatically east in those early centuries. In fact, as far as China, following the trade routes, But we hear about the Syro-Malabars, for example, in India. We hear about the churches of the East going through Persia and elsewhere. The church expanded into that culture very successfully, very creatively. My point there is that's the Catholic genius, is we're not tied to any particular culture, and we have the power to assimilate all cultures. The Francis Xavier, Matteo Ricci instinct is a good one. When I always love that in Xavier, when he said it, when he was in India, he dressed as a pauper and grew his hair long and his beard long and poured dust on his head. Why? Well, that's what holy people did in India. When he got to China and Japan, he wore aristocrats' robes and perfumed his head and shaved his beard. Why? That's what holy people did. And so what he's saying was, all right, I'll go in your door. But see what Xavier knew, the old Jesuit principle, but then you'll come out my door. It wasn't, I'll go in your door and I'll stay. I'll go in your door and I'll become one of you. He said, no, I'll do what I have to do. I'll be a pauper in India. I'll be an aristocrat in Japan. Whatever works, to announce the gospel. But by God, you're coming out my doors. See, was Xavier's instinct. As I look at the Ferreira figure, played by Liam Neeson, the Ferreira, the old Jesuit, is he was giving all these kind of exculpating, self-justifying speeches about cultural relativism and even, the superiority of a Japanese culture and all that. And I thought, oh man, I've heard a lot of that in my own time. I've heard that kind of rhetoric that undermines the evangelical impulse of the missionaries. Yes, we love all the cultures we come to, and we're appropriately critical of them too. But the main thing is not the culture. The main thing is the gospel. And we'll relate to the culture in as creative and engaging a way as we can. See, I'm driving it. But it's not a question of, oh, no, we're going to cave into the culture that we're addressing. That, I think, was the strategy of the old Jesuit. Sadly, in the book and the movie, young Rodriguez follows him and becomes basically his mentee.
Now let's turn our attention for the last few minutes here to the actual film version. We've been talking in general about the plot. What was your first reaction when you heard that Martin Scorsese, of all people, was going to be directing this film based on silence?
Yeah, I was enthusiastic. I mean, I've been a Scorsese fan for a long time. Go back to, Raging Bull and Taxi Driver and Goodfellas and the greatest rock concert movie of all time, The Last Waltz. These are all Scorsese productions. And I've always admired him as a filmmaker. How can you not? I mean, in terms of cinematography, in terms of narrativity, he usually calls on some of the finest actors of the time. And all that's true of silence. So, I was enthused about it. I knew, having wrestled with the book, I knew this was not Man for All Seasons. This is not going to be, or even not The Mission. Think of another movie about Jesuit missionaries, right? Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons play these Jesuit missionaries from the next century who are now working in South America, and who are both deeply heroic figures and die defending their people. I knew it wasn't that kind of story. I knew it was a much more ambiguous, kind of textured, multivalent story. It's not the feel-good movie of the year. You don't come out saying, "Wow, am I on fire to become a Jesuit missionary?" It's a sobering movie, and it's thought-provoking. And the fact that you and I have been talking about now for the past 20 minutes is a sign that it's this was an interesting story to tell. But I'll tell you, I don't know how much time we have, Brandon, but what bugged me was not so much the movie qua movie. I mean, I'd recommend, sure, go see it, read the book. What bugged me a little bit, more than a little bit, was a lot of the religious commentary afterward, which seemed to me sort of fawning and, oh, how wonderful, that the faith is shown in this multivalent, conflicted way, and, these guys, and we understand the struggles they had. Would we feel that way if there was a movie about, some special ops from our country who were trained for a difficult mission and they were put behind enemy lines? They met people on the ground, locals who were supporting their mission. Those locals are now captured by the enemy. They don't surrender the mission. They themselves are put to death. Then the special ops are eventually arrested, and they end up betraying the mission and, in fact, going over to the other side. I mean, would we tell that story and say, oh, how complex and multi-layered their patriotism is? No, I think we'd say, no, these two guys, I get it. I understand the struggle, but these two guys were cowards and traitors, So I was a little bit put off by let's find every possible excuse for this very divided, privatized faith. Because, I think that's what the elite of our time likes every bit as much as the elite in Japan in the 17th century liked it. You know what I mean? Is the elite today like Christianity that's kind of weak and vacillating and divided. So I'm wary of that.
And that's why, to put a bow on it here, you said that the real stars or the real heroes of the movie were not Ferreira, it was not Rodriguez, it was the seaside martyrs. Right, because those people I mentioned, those heroic, noble presbyteroi, those elders that kept the faith alive, when they were captured, they died rather than surrender the priests. They died in this horrific manner. It's the scene that stays in my mind the most, is they're crucified at the seaside. And the tide is just allowed to come in over the course of 3 or 4 days, where they're just very slowly and awfully drowned, right? And see, the time involved was important. It was to give them the opportunity to say, I give up, right? If you cut someone's head off, well, it's over pretty quickly. But a 3 or 4 day crucifixion,
The whole purpose was so that they would say, all right, I give in, right? Well, they didn't give in. They didn't give in. In my judgment, they're the heroes of the movie.
Well, it's time now for one of our questions from our listeners. And if you have a question, we'd love to hear it. Just visit askbishopbarron.com. You can record your question there on any device. Today, I think we have a record. We have a question from the youngest listener in Word on Fire history. This question comes from Rainey Grace, who's a young child, with a very poignant question. So here's Rainey.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Rainy Grace. I was wondering, where did we start before we were made? Did we start in heaven or somewhere else? Thank you.
Wow, that's a great question. That reminds me, when I was teaching theology, I always told the students, I said, listen to kids. And I really mean that. Listen to kids. They got the best theological questions, because they haven't learned all this kind of sophisticated, blah, blah, but they kind of cut right to the heart of it. It's a good question. Where were we, or how did we start before we were born? The best way I think that our tradition answers that question is to say that we existed in the mind of God. In other words, God knew us before we were formed in the womb, right? God had an idea of us before he made us. And in some ways, the purpose of life is to grow in accord with the idea that God had of us before we were born. It's sort of an ideal version of ourselves. And the whole point of the spiritual life and the moral life is now to grow into greater conformity with that idea. So I would say we existed as ideas, as a dream in the mind of God.
Well, thanks again for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire Show. If you go to wordonfireshow.com, we have links to Bishop Barron's in-depth commentary on the movie Silence. We have his article, his video commentary. You'll find other links there as well. So be sure to visit wordonfireshow.com for that great info. Well, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire Show.